Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So, as I've been coming on and doing questions and answers recently, both on my devotee page and also on my secular page and in emails, I've gotten several inquiries along the lines of, what do you think about this? I'll explain what this is in a minute. I'm not so much investing a deep amount of energy in material subjects and material dealings, but there's been like an overwhelming kind of request. I don't know if overwhelming is the right word. I have obviously a lot of associates from my previous secular career and professions and all of that, and also just within the devotee community. So it's not unusual that maybe people just are looking for an opinion regarding this, meaning some contemporary social events, particularly regarding the police and the minority community interactions, and some of the things that we've seen play out as a result of those interactions. I told people that, people have different opinions and different angles of vision on it, and one person that I did have some dialogue with was a previous associate, not a previous associate, someone I know, and they live on the West Coast, and they took more of a, come on, we need to discuss this sort of thing. And I explained to them that, my firm belief, and I'm stating this in the beginning, is that nothing changes in terms of the entire material arena unless and until consciousness changes. Because the essential mechanism of change is when individuals change. And when individuals change, then there's a collective change. So it's not a question of simply, just having discussions and emoting and catharting. That may be necessary for some people. I'm not also denying that. But, I've been grounded for so many years now in the reality that the material arena is an arena where so much kind of karmic portfolios are unfolding, and there's so many dynamics regarding the nature of the absence of spirituality and the focus on God. So those things are not going to change in my worldview. So me, giving an opinion about what I think regarding social issues is still going to come from that paradigm. And, it may or may not be, something that resonates with everybody. Some people, if you are completely absorbed in the material arena and perhaps believe that all of the solutions and all of the answers are going to be found in material manipulations, if we do this, if we do that, if we do this, and that is not inclusive of making a change in consciousness, then I believe it's really a merry-go-round of activity, which, simply is going to cycle itself. Because again, until and unless consciousness changes, there is no individual change and hence no collective change. Also, anyone is naive if they think that there are not broader implications and broader influences at work in the entire arena of what's going on in the material world. You're just naive or uninformed or uncaring if you think that things are going on organically and these things are being generated. And when I'm talking about these things, I mean these social interactions between police and minority community, that all this is just happening in some kind of organic fashion based on the narrative of racism and this and that. If you think that that's what's happening, then I really don't know what to tell you or what to say. But I will give some insight according to what I genuinely feel. One is that first some perspective needs to be given. The first thing is that any human emotion is individual. It may have the ability to be experienced by, everyone, but a particular emotion is an individual experience. So a particular worldview is also shaped individually by people's karma, their upbringing, their mindset. So there is no such thing really as something being institutionalized. And the idea of something being institutional impersonalizes, if that's a word, impersonalizes the idea that racism, for instance, is an institutional or systemic thing, and takes away the idea that it is an individual experience. So that's the first thing. So I know that may get some pushback because we want to say, no, maybe there is a such thing as systemic or institutional racism or hatred or bigotry. But actually, those feelings come from individuals. If you get a collective of individuals who are setting policies, right, you could say, well, those policies are racist or this or that, but it's still coming from individuals. Therefore, there is no impersonal conception of something being systemic or institutionalized. It always boils down to somebody is racist or somebody is misusing or exploiting, etc., etc. It's never some ambiguous, impersonal system. Everything that's happening in terms of human dynamics and interchanges is personal. So if anybody really wants to get to the root of why something is happening, you have to examine persons, not systems. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's impossible to take the mass narrative that's given on anything these days without either researching yourself or at least putting together elements that give you a perspective. What I mean by that, I'm going to give an example. Somehow or another, what we are able to see via media is that all of the interactions between law enforcement and the minority community, I'm just gonna, let me say it this way. There are, I think, rough estimates, I don't know anymore, I knew it at one time, there's roughly about 1 million sworn officers on various departments throughout the country. So 1 million sworn officers throughout the country. On an average, in the day-to-day dealings, that's traffic stops or calls for service or whatever it might be, each of those officers at a minimum probably has at least 3. So you're averaging it out. So this thing, like small towns may not be as much, bigger cities will be more, but average 3 citizen interactions per shift, right? So you're talking about 1 million officers, a minimum of 3 interactions, right? And you're talking about 2 shifts a day, right? But let's just stick with the larger number, the 1 million officers, 3 interactions with citizens a day. So you're talking about 3 million encounters between law enforcement and citizens each day. Somehow, out of those 3 million contacts, the contacts that go awry or that go wrong are the contacts that make news or are put in the media and generated back to the populace at large, right? All the ones that go wrong, pretty much. Every now and then, a hero story is sprinkled in that this fireman, this policeman, this, soldier, whatever, did this heroic act. But in general, the narrative is always those encounters which went wrong. Those encounters, when you do the math, comprise less than 0.5%, if that, of the total encounters that go on each day between officers and citizens. So a question has to arise. This is not an excuse for encounters that go wrong, so don't go down that line. This does not excuse encounters that go wrong. And they have to be dealt with according to their individual circumstances. Absolutely. But in terms of a narrative which shapes a conception, how is it that a less than 0.5% of these encounters are looped in the media as being the essential relationship between law enforcement and the community? That's the first question. Because if we only have less than 0.5% that we see to go wrong, and if you want to add it up to say, let's say 1%, right, for the ones that don't get reported or something, right? How would still that minority portion of encounters become the staple narrative of how law enforcement and the citizenry interact? How could that be possible? Why is that important? Because both the community and the law enforcement, they're not two separate things. Law enforcement is comprised of people from the community. Now, that doesn't mean in a literal sense that every single member in law enforcement is part of a particular neighborhood or community. But it means from the overall community, in other words, law enforcement officers didn't descend from space, right? So they're another, some other species or something. They're members of communities who took that job, right? And the people in the communities at large, they also have jobs and so forth and so on. So now you have a situation where the law enforcement community and the community at large, they have interactions. Again, that minority of interactions that go awry, why is that the prominent theme that is looped, replayed, emphasized in the media? Is it that news is best when it's bad news? I'm trying to understand. Is news best when it's bad news? So realistically, what also happens is that when that sort of social programming takes place like that, what it does is it perpetuates itself, and especially for young minority men and women, right, who have to have police encounters at some point or another, perhaps, what happens is that those encounters now don't become individual anymore. It doesn't become this person who has this job as a law enforcement officer now is executing their job somehow or another and having an interaction with this individual person. It becomes this person is now identified with every incident that has ever gone wrong, right? So in that person's mind, they're thinking that I'm no longer just myself, the individual, but I'm every single incident that went wrong. Whether it is Breonna Taylor, whether it is George Floyd, whether it is Philando Castile, whether it is Tamir Rice, whether it is Trayvon Martin, whatever it is, I'm every single incident that went wrong. And the officer is thinking I'm in that category of perception of every other officer that has done something wrong. So he's no longer feeling like an individual, and the person who may have that encounter is also not feeling the circumstances of their interaction is going to be individual. It is a whole history that's built into the interaction. Therefore, the table has already been set for controversy, ill feelings, ill will, apprehension, fear, and every other thing that leads to the possibility of that encounter going wrong. There's also an intrinsic anger that takes place because, again, if let's say I'm being stopped by a police officer in a traffic stop, that police officer is not stopping me in a traffic stop. They hate me. They want to kill me. So the narrative is playing out like that. So by the time they get to the front window and ask, can I have your license registration? We are already enemies. I don't know them from Adam, but we've already become enemies because now the constantly pushed narrative has set up a vibration around our interaction that's full of ill motives and ill will and supposition and everything else. So we're not meeting as two individuals. I'm not responding to him like he's somebody who does a job or she does a job. And the officer in many cases is also coming with all kinds of apprehensions, fear, not to mention that percentage of officers who do approach with their inherent biases, racism, etc., etc. And that works both ways. In many cases, the person being stopped is also operating from their own inherent biases and racism and so forth and so on. So what I'm answering here is that the situation under which these interactions are taking place are being socially engineered. It's lost any individuality. It's lost any idea of normalcy in terms of two individuals coming together, even if the circumstances are not ideal, right? As two individuals, right? The ability of this person to do a job and me to respond to that person doing their job as two individuals is lost now in a history and narrative that's constantly played. Even though it's less than 1% of all the interactions, it's being played as though it is the norm, that it is the reality. And therefore, it's almost setting up a situation, especially for young African American men and minority men and women, to become martyred by simple interactions of things like traffic stops and police inquiries and things like that. That's completely ridiculous. Again, it does not speak to or excuse those who've taken to a career in law enforcement who don't operate in that profession according to a professional standard. But also we should understand everybody that graduates from Harvard Law is not going to be a great lawyer. Everybody who graduates from Yale, any medical school is not going to be a great doctor. There's no reason to think that there's some homogenous idea that if you graduate from law enforcement training, you're going to be excellent at being a law enforcement officer. No more than it is a fact that any profession, when people take that education and graduate, they're going to be outstanding in that field. And those who are less than professional, less than stellar in their ability to execute the job of being a law enforcement officer, then they should be held accountable like everyone else would be. A doctor would be subject to malpractice, right? Any other profession, if you don't meet the standard of care of that profession, you'd be held responsible. If you're a law enforcement officer and you fail to meet the standard of care for that profession, you should be held responsible. But the idea that we're going to build up a institutional relationship between the community and law enforcement that is inherently wrought with perceptions of a mutual hatred for one another and a mutual insinuation that there is a idea that, well, no, this person, this individual, mind you, not the institution, this individual has the intention to do me harm right from the very beginning. Or the perception by the police, this person, right, is automatically criminal or has ill intent or this or that. On both sides of that equation, it has to stop. It has to stop. First of all, there has to be some realization, again, you are talking about less than really 0.5% of the amount of interactions that take place. Why anyone would take up that narrative and perpetuate it as an absolute reality, you should first of all question that. Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody take the potential of so many individual lives being impacted and promote a narrative that sets up a dynamic that when these two elements come together, it almost always may come out wrong? Why would somebody set up a situation like that? So that's the first thing. I think if you start doing inquiry into that, I think people will get a lot more insight into what's really going on, right? That's one thing. Secondly, again, that's probably not going to happen until people start looking more at, well, we need to change consciousness. We need to be less divisive as a whole. We need to question things that are put in our domain that indicate being divided. We need to stop looking at being divided according to race, religion, gender, and all other kinds of things. We need to stop. We need to just say, listen, we are all souls in the long run. Whatever your karmic portfolio might be, everybody is a soul, right? And there's only really one common denominator for everyone, right? And that's the existence of something supreme. That's just a fact. Whether it's acknowledged or not, that's the fact, right? And as long as that point is not acknowledged, it leaves room for other people to come in and manipulate a narrative that's divisive. Because then we put more faith in those persons than we do in the fact of a common supreme dynamic that is unifying. Whatever nomenclature, whatever path it is or lack of path, right? Still there is a unified idea that we are all souls and we have certain intrinsic relationship based on that, right? But the idea of people selling us division wholesale, right? We need to be extremely careful. And my answer to all of the inquiries, I stayed pretty generic and tried not to get into specific cases and so forth and so on. But my general response to it is what I just said, right? That we need to be careful that a narrative is being set up to create certain socially engineered outcomes. And it's almost like people don't care if as part of that social engineering, part of that social agenda, that so many people have situations like we've had where, you know, young people are losing their lives and, you know, many people who've taken to the profession of law enforcement are also either losing their lives or losing their minds because they entered the profession under one consideration and now you have all of these things going on, right? So, yeah, we need to look more insightfully at the whole picture and begin to understand, right? Because also one of the things that's happening is we're almost starting to set up a situation where the actual dynamics of an individual situation are not as important anymore as who the players are. So, for instance, if you get a white law enforcement officer and a minority person whom they are dealing with, then instantly that is a classification under the systemic idea of racism, etc., etc. So it doesn't matter what the individual dynamics are. That's all backseat to the primary narrative of racism and division. Stop. Stop. Everyone is individual. Every situation is individual. And that whole idea of perpetuating almost a universal ideal, right, that people will fall under, that's an agenda. That's somebody's agenda, and you need to question it. So I don't want to go too long down this track. It's not something I put a lot of my focus into. At the same time, my head has been out of the sand for many, many years. And that's in part a great deal of why I've chosen and dedicated myself to a spiritual path, because I realize consciousness is the key, and the upliftment of consciousness is the answer to everything. And, you know, that's where I am on that. I thought it necessary to very quickly try to answer that, so that at least the flow of those things stop happening. Because, you know, not only did it seem to proliferate based on the recent incidents here, but every time that something's happened, a lot of times both my secular associates and also some devotees and a lot of younger devotees will ask, oh, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Right? So that's my general view for previous things, for things to come. And, you know, hopefully nobody is offended, or nobody is, you know, takes this to be anything other than my personal feeling and opinion on issues. And if anybody would like to dialogue on it, that is one thing. I'm not really open to like this, you know, elongated debates and going down a whole material track, right? But if somebody wants some simple dialogue and some discussion, that's one thing. All right, on to Seva. Vanchakalapatulvishya kripashinda bevacha patitana pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sri Gaur Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare. Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Jai Radhe Radhe.